My name is Bob Surridge. I'm a volunteer and member of the Board of Directors of the Southport Historical Society, and you're at our January 2019 first Tuesday talk of the year. Right? And our speaker is going to be my friend and colleague, Lisa Anderson. And Lisa is working with the Historical Society really as, she has her title up there, Director of Public Outreach and Education. So, and she's actually doing her job today. And this is outreach, and we hope education. Maybe we all talk, we can educate each other. And we're really excited because we, working with Lisa, developing, I think it's gonna be a fantastic series of African-American heritage exhibits at the Fort Johnston Museum and Visitors Center. The Historical Society works hand in glove with the city's tourism office to keep and update historical exhibits at the museum. And so this is going to be one of those exhibits. The grand opening is going to be February 9th. And of course, everyone's will be invited to that. Lisa's also worked over the last couple of months for doing another outreach things, but one of the things she did was to kind of revamp our two websites. The one is the Susie Carson Research Room online database that's been revamped and working better. But the other is the society's webpage, and now you can do things on that webpage like pay your membership dues online, or become a member online, or order books and have them mailed to you, or you can we'll drop them off at your house, whatever you would like. I have picked out this book to use as a prop, but I'm not sure that a lot of folks know about this book. And this is Susie Carson's third book that she wrote. First one was Joshua's Dream. There's really the history of Southport from 1560s through 1945 or so. And then the second one is Joshua's Legacy, which is about individuals in Southport history and those folks that really contributed to that history. This one is kind of a vanity book. It is about her mother. Lila Jane Sellers was Susie Carson's mother. And it's got a cuteness, if you will, because of that, because you get stories about mom. But it also does really a nice job of depicting the history of that time, which would be the 1920s through the 1940s. So this is one of the books you can buy online, or you can go to the Visitors Center store or the Maritime Museum store, pick up one of our books. Okay. Is that enough commercial? Let me also introduce Musette Stack, former president of the Historical Society and the community's resident historian. And your next workshop or class.
Seminar. Oh, it's not a class, and no grades. You don't have to go.
And that seminar, the title of that seminar is?
It's all of March, and the title is Dispelling the Southern Myths of Secession, Slavery, Speech, and Sex. But that sex is a synonym for S-E-X. It's S-E-C-T-S.
Thank you.
But it gets your attention.
When is that?
And let me introduce Ken Morris is also a volunteer and member of the Historical Society. Let me stress the volunteer word, because how many of you want to become a volunteer? Raise your hand.
Oh, come on. There we go.
All right.
Oh, wait, you can't sign up for the class here. That's the telephone number I'll give you, yeah.
Okay.
The newsletter works, it got out fast. There were several people who called yesterday and said, sign me up for the class. She said, I thought you weren't gonna start till March. I said, I'm not. But when so people can register here.
Let me release the floor to Lisa, because she is, after all, our speaker.
Right.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm really excited that you guys are here today. Happy New Year. I think for Historical Society, it is going to be a wonderful year. We have a lot of great things planned, a lot of programs. We've got some new people who are coming in with great fresh ideas, and we've got people around with a lot of history and a lot of wonderful things to offer, so it's going to be a great year. And as Bob said, we would love to have new volunteers. There's always more than enough stuff for people to do. So, having said that, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the new exhibit that Bob mentioned that will be opening on February 9th. The overarching theme is African American history and culture in Southport. With an emphasis beginning on education. And so the exhibit concept in a nutshell is basically, as I said, it'll start with education. That will be up for a period of time, and then we will rotate topics to encompass things like business and entrepreneurship, church life, music and art, military service, and perhaps some other topics over time. And as each topic rotates out of the museum physically, it will then become an online exhibit as part of our website. So that data will continue to grow, and people even outside of our local area, then if they are interested, can see that work as well. The exhibit objective is really to cultivate awareness and appreciation of the significant contributions of African Americans in Southport. I think to date, so far in our museum, there's been a little bit of underrepresentation, and so it was an effort from the Historical Society and Randy Jones and his team of tourism for the city to really put a focus on bringing to light some of the information that was so sorely missing. So the goals are to ensure that an inclusive history of Southport is told, to promote and embrace cultural diversity in Southport, and to inspire our youth by informing them about the accomplishments and contributions of the African American community. So before I start to say anything else at all, I want you all to know I am a story facilitator. This is not my story, but I am totally passionate about this story. I am just a facilitator, and I am offering community insights and experiences that are the heart of this project. They're from voices from the long ago past and some wonderful folks who have been so helpful to me in giving me their experiences and their input about going to Brunswick College, or BCT and BCHS High School. So I am really just getting my arms around this information to tell the story and relaying it. And some of the people that I really want to thank, because they have had a tremendous impact on my ability to get this story together, is Ms. Judy Gordon, Colonel Willie Gore, Mr. Donnie Joyner, Mrs. Jean Parker, Ms. Musette Steck, Mrs. Lois Gore Thompson, and Mrs. Ennis Tobler. So it is really a compilation of efforts from all of these wonderful people supporting the program. So, a fierce desire for education prevails is really the heart of this piece of the exhibit. I think it is an amazing story that was true back through history here in the African American community that I'm going to tell you about, but I think it's something that we need to think about in present day as well as far as education in Southport and Brunswick County goes. Few people who are not right in the midst of the scenes can form any exact idea of the intense desire which the people of my race showed for education. It was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to attempt to learn. And that was dear Booker T. Washington, which was an educator and a philanthropist himself. And I think that really kind of summarizes what I'm going to try to show you today. Starting with philanthropy and Black education, there was the Jeans Fund. And the Jeans Fund was really put together to educate the educators and create a team of supervisors and teachers who could go out amongst the community and they could further the education and continue growing the teacher pool. Booker T. Washington cultivated Anna Jeans. He was very instrumental in helping her to direct her funding because she had a heart for funding. She was a Quaker, and Booker T was in her life at the right time. He actually even became a chairman of the Board of Trustees. And in 1907, Anna pledged $1 million to the betterment of basic education for blacks in rural American schools, which was amazing at that day and age. The Jeans Fund was unique in several ways because it was created by a woman, it had a racially integrated board, it became international, and it existed all the way up until 1968. And while the Jeans and other Northern philanthropists like Julius Rosenwald envisioned students receiving better vocational and manual labor-related instruction, the Jeans supervising teachers found ways to use their talents, their skills, their time, their passion to benefit the communities. They went way above and beyond just education in the classroom, which kind of carried through, and you'll see that as a theme with the educators in this presentation. So what's so special about the Jeans supervisors? The first Jeans teachers were considered industrial teachers, but by 1918, they had gained deeper skills and their range of responsibilities broadened. They worked towards improving the communities they served in the home as well as in the classroom. They encouraged children to attend school, and they raised money to lengthen the school term. They raised funds to build and maintain Rosenwald Schools. They served as liaisons between the black schools and the white county and state school administrations and reported to the community superintendent and the state agency for Negro education. So they were really, there was a huge spectrum of responsibility. They simultaneously addressed literacy, illiteracy, and poverty through their communities. They were in everything. They were everywhere. And part of what the exhibit is going to entail is some of the documentation from Brunswick County. There was a woman, Ms. Alston, who was pretty amazing. I've been trying to really nail down her length of tenure, but I know she was a supervisor here in Brunswick County in 1949 and 1950. But I have her documentation and records showing what she did every day, because she had to send it into the superintendent to be approved so she'd get her paycheck. And it was just extraordinary to see that. So there'll be binders with information if you want to see the kind of detail like that about the work that they did. Also is Miss Miriam Peaches Gore. She was the first Jeans teacher at BCT. And then she went on to serve as supervisor of the black public schools in Brunswick County. So both of these women were incredibly important in the infrastructure of schools and supervisors and educators here in Southport. Another instance of, yes sir?
What's BCT?
BCT is Brunswick County Training School. That is the official name, and thank you, yes, I'm gonna get into that detail, but yes, that's what it stands for. Later in time, it became Brunswick County High School, but in the early days, it was Brunswick County Training School, which is known to most people as BCT for short. Another instance of philanthropy was the Rosenwald Schools in the rural South. So again, influenced by Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald created the Rosenwald Fund, which was active from 1912 until 1932. Now, Julius Rosenwald was a Chicago CEO of Sears, Roebuck and Company, and he was very well-to-do. And again, just like Anna T. Jeans, he wanted to figure out the best way that he could utilize his funds to further education. So again, the timing was perfect. Booker T. Washington was a key individual in his life and was able to influence him to create the Rosenwald Fund. And the Rosenwald Fund was really interesting. Rosenwald didn't just give money to communities to say, here, go build a school. He wanted people to be all in. He wanted people to commit to creating these schools and to bettering education. So he did a program where it was kind of like matching grants. So he would supply seed money, and then the African American and the white community would be tapped to raise funds through a whole ton of different ways of fundraisers and whatnot, to make up the amount of money that was required for the project. So that was something interesting and kind of a different way of doing funding. Millions of dollars were raised by African American rural communities across the South to fund better education for their children. And again, they had to reach out to the white community as well as to local government to try to augment those funds to get enough money to build the schools. More than 5,300 school buildings were constructed throughout 15 southern states. More were built in Northern Carolina than any other state, with a total of 813 by the end of the program. And another interesting thing, specifically around Rosenwald Schools, and I go into great detail in the exhibit, is they noticed that there were substandard buildings being utilized for education. Sometimes they were one-room schoolrooms, and they were lacking in just the basic comforts for humans to go and learn. And so Rosenwald and an incredibly smart team of people that he put together, engineers and architects, decided to come up with these various floor plans, a 2-teacher schoolhouse, a 4-teacher, 7-teacher, and they took into account things like bringing in natural lighting, being able to have plumbing or an outside facility at least nearby, and just normal things that we take for granted every day. But those things were lacking back at that time, and Rosenwald and his team really tried to address that by creating some standards. And they were very specific about which way the buildings faced, how much land was around it. So it was a step forward for sure in the rural South.
Were there Rosenwald Schools here in Brunswick County?
Indeed, thank you for asking that. Segue into the next one.
That was a plan.
I'll give you your $5 later. So Rosenwald Schools in Brunswick County. In 1921, the African American community in Southport raised $8,920 for construction of the first Brunswick County Training School, or BCT. And they were using the Rosenwald 4-teacher floor plan. Everyone was thrilled. The funding sources, based on Fisk University sources, the black community, 2,000 whites, 1,300 public, $4,420, and Rosenwald put in $1,200. So that was how the funding broke out for this initial school. Unfortunately, the school was completed, but the students were never able to attend because there was a fire in January of 1922. So right before school was supposed to start, there was this mysterious fire, and it was never solved. Yeah. And ironically, the bank that had insured that building suddenly closed its doors, and those school funds were lost. So that's a pretty sad story, and you would think that that would pretty much kill somebody's desire and attempt to do anything further because they got shut down. Well, it didn't, because the African American community was incredibly resilient, and so they said, we're gonna start all over again, and we're gonna make this happen. So the community took steps once again, and they started working on Brunswick BCT number 2. It was completed in 1924, and it was to provide academic and vocational training to the community. The first graduating class was in 1929 with a huge size of 1 student, Miss Bertha Bryant. What an honor it must have been for her to be the first graduating student. I can't imagine how amazing that must have felt. It was the only black school that went past the 7th grade to the 12th grade back until the 1950s. And in the early years, the school session in most of the rural South was only for a few months during the winter because kids had to stay back at home and try to help their parents, whether it was on the farm or helping with younger siblings, because the parents were just working hard and they needed all the extra hands they could get. So it was a very limited time frame that children could even have the opportunity to go to school. So when they did get that opportunity, there was just a great passion to get an education. And so for BCT number 2, the black community raised $5,000, a little over $5,000. The white community, $1,500. Other public, $33.25. I don't know who that other public is. And then Rosenwald donated the $1,500 for that school. Rosenwald was celebrated throughout the history of BCT, and they actually even had a Rosenwald Day, and that's not just at BCT, but in the rural South, at all of the Rosenwald schools, they set aside a day to celebrate Rosenwald. They basically gave thanks and they put together a wonderful program, and I have a sample of one that will be available at the exhibit so you can see what that was like. I'll also have some other Rosenwald things, such as the community school plan that shows the floor plans that were available to be built based on the number of teachers. Also, which speaks to the desire for families and for children to get the education. Until the 1950s, there weren't school buses to take children to school in Southport, but the students didn't let that stop them. During the week, they would stay in town, away from their family and their parents many times, and they would stay with a host family or teachers so that they could get to school every day. Yes, ma'am?
So Lisa, those first 2 schools, where were they located? Were they on Lord Street where the?
BCT number 2 is still, and it's in a newer version, still on Lord Street. Yes, that building still exists. It's kind of gone through a lot of different renditions, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but yeah, it is right on Lord Street.
The children had to come from Sunset Harbor. That's way down the road. They came here, so I mean, it wasn't just in Southport.
Right.
And where that golf course is, at that Fort something golf course, that was another Rosenwald school
Okay,
out there for.
Oh, Old Fort
Yeah, that's
on
it.
133.
Yeah.
gotcha, okay. So, this is probably my favorite part, is the educators. They were custodians of future generations. Starting off with Professor Frank Besser Gordon. He was born in 1856 and died in 1939. He was born as a slave on the John C. Swain plantation and was freed at the age of 9. His early education was at St. Philip's Church, located over on Moore Street. And as a young boy, he was so hungry to learn, he paid a gentleman to teach him math equations. And he paid that gentleman 5 cents for every 2 fraction problem that he would teach him. What kid do you know today that is going to say, sir, can you please, I will pay you to teach me math. That does not happen. So I love that example. And then he went on to be an amazing educator himself in Brunswick County. And for 55 years, he taught so many people in Brunswick County, and I just think that kind of sets the stage for the level of passion that we're talking about. Another wonderful woman, Sarah Mackenzie Evans Moore. She was born in 1879, and she completed 4 years of high school, and she began teaching at BCT in 1925. And near the end of her illustrious teaching career, she earned a whole $800 a year. So, not educators, not a lot of pay. It's still a problem. And then there's Professor Cavanis. I did a lot of interviews with local folks who went to BC or Brunswick County High School and asked for their impressions, asked for who made an impact on your life that you can look back at today and point to turning you around or giving you hope or inspiring you. And I got a lot of different answers, different educators and family members and people in the community. However, Professor Cavanis was like the #1 go-to. Absolutely everyone mentioned him as having an incredible impact on their life. And so he was principal from 1932 until his retirement in 1970. Due to his strong role modeling and intense dedication to his students, he was one of the most well-loved and respected educators at BCHS. He was known to be a little strict. However, he was known to care about those students and put them above everything else, inside school and outside of school. His entire life was dedicated to improving the school situation in many, many ways that we'll talk about, and improving students' lives. So, in some of the ways that he improved school was to use motivational tactics, such as bringing in a band, or bringing in other basketball team, you know, things like that didn't exist until he figured out that not only was that going to enrich the students' lives, but that was also going to motivate them to do better in school as well. So he was known as being a strict teacher, but fair. And he had respect for his students, and every single person I spoke to said he respected us. We may not have liked getting in trouble, but we knew that he was being fair with us. And he made the best of inferior equipment and inadequate funding. He kind of was there through some really tough times, and there weren't enough materials. There weren't great tools for the teachers to work with to educate their students, but he did everything within his power to turn that around and make the best of an unfortunate situation. And Mrs. Innes told her, when I interviewed her, I love this, she said, he cared for us like we were his children. What teachers do you know that, some, I'm sure, but across the board, that's a pretty strong statement for years later a student to remember that, man, he just treated us like his children. That speaks volumes to me about Professor Cavanis. And then my favorite story about him, thanks to Donnie Joyner, one of our local historians, he shared with me this letter that was written to him from Gloria Chester Howard Clark back in 2014, which was Alvin Cavanis's grandniece. So she wrote this letter to Donnie, and I'll read it to you. On one occasion when we were talking, Uncle Alvin told me about when back in the 1930s, how he would go out in the woods at night to meet with white principals to get their old books to take back to his school. He said the books was sometimes old and raggedy, but at least his students could have something to read from since there wasn't enough books at his school. I asked him, wasn't he scared of going out along in a time he could have gotten killed? And he said, of course. Uncle Alvin said, no, because he was doing what was helping the kids. I know for sure that Uncle Alvin's life was helping others, and working with kids was his reason for living. He told me if he could do anything to help make things better, then he would. So, again, to the level of passion and dedication and that fierce desire to educate, I think that's an excellent example. How many of us would be willing to go out under incredibly dangerous circumstances into the dark of night to go and get books for our students? I mean, that is pretty dedicated.
It was dangerous for both men.
No doubt, no doubt.
Really?
Sure, absolutely, that's a very good point, yeah. So, above and beyond the classroom, it's all about respect. Something that really, again, rose to the top when I spoke with people and when I did the research reading. The educators at BCT did more than teach academia. It was beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic. They taught life skills and how to be a good citizen. They nurtured students and spent plenty of quality one-on-one time with them, and they really ensured that everybody's needs were met. Lois Gore was telling me how one of her teachers, Mrs. Green, she would just stay after with her. You know, it didn't matter. She would spend her personal time whenever Lois needed it to help her. And they were extremely positive role models on every level. And again, this comes from multiple people. It wasn't just in the classroom and on the grounds of the school. They were mindful of how they spoke, how they dressed, how they behaved, how they responded to difficult situations in everyday life in the community, because they wanted to be the ultimate role models for their students. So it really gave the children someone to look up to and to aspire to be like. And the high standards were set for students, but everyone knew what was expected of them, and they had such a high regard for their teachers. They were really motivated to work hard and excel. And here's just a few of the faces of some of the educators through time at BCT. And the school is also a huge source of community pride. Obviously, we've talked about how much people put into it, their own funding, their own blood, sweat, and tears. There were wonderful programs even outside of the standard academic programs. There was a wonderful brick masonry department, and they won state competitions. And there was there was also a veterans program that was a part of the school. So it was definitely the industrial aspect, which was traditional in the rural South. It was the academia, but then it was so much more than that. And Colonel Willie Gore, he's wonderful. He's a neighbor of mine, and he was so helpful in talking to me. And he really sparked the aha moment for me when I was trying to decide, how am I going to frame this story? And he said the school was the center of our universe. And that was, the light bulb went off, because it really was. It was the education piece for sure. But it provided a central place for students and the African American community to come together for sports events, social events, celebrations, programs such as basketball, marching band, chorus and glee, dance. They were all a positive part of the life for children and their parents and families alike. Many people told me stories of, like, on Friday nights, everybody would be at the basketball games. And I'm sure that's true all over the South and all over the U.S. But that was such a memory, a distinct and vivid memory for people, that everybody just gathered at BCT for the basketball games. And I love this picture. This picture is circa 1940s. This was in the old
Gym with the stage.
thank you, Gymatorium. Thank you. And then here's just some of the pictures of some of the wonderful band and basketball for girls and boys, and cheering squad and chorus. There was just so much richness, and it was all just out of a desire to build that community, to build education. Speaking of community, the power of community and advocating for change was also a big part of this story. There was a quote from an article in the pilot. The article was called "Anthony Davis Personified BCT Pride." Anthony Davis was an amazing educator at BCT and coach. And the quote that I pulled out of it was actually by Timothy Davis. And he was son of Anthony Davis. He said, people in the community, the PTA, and Band Boosters Club, they just rallied and sold popcorn, cake raffles, sponsored trips, all kinds of fundraisers to support programs at the school, especially the band program. So the community really wrapped itself around the school and the students, and they put so much time and energy and love into just making these programs better and funding them. And through dedication and determination, they made a lot of things happen at the school. There was a lot of progress made. You know, the Rosenwald step in schools was a step, forward, but the facilities, materials still weren't what they should be. And it was still a significant delta between reality and separate but equal. Substandard facilities, limited supplies, secondhand equipment, overcrowded classrooms, low budgets. These were all obstacles that students and educators had to overcome. Yet, these challenges would not stop the BCT parents, teachers, and students from persevering. Georgia K. Lewis, she did an oral history with someone at the Historical Society, and in that paper she wrote, Alvin Calvinist had a philosophy that sometimes adverse situations bring out the best in people. And that really was how they operated, was, yeah, things are not what they should be. It's not a bed of roses, this is not a walk in the park. But they made the absolute best out of it all. Another quote from that article about Anthony Davis was from Ralph Parker, who was an alumni and an educator. He says, I can witness as a student and as a teacher there, it was a pitiful situation for kids to try and play basketball and have gym class, and he's referencing the Gymatorium that you saw in that previous picture. It had become pretty dilapidated. The ceiling was so bad that it began to droop right in the middle. The county had the nerve to come out and put a 4-inch steel pipe right where you would normally jump the ball at the beginning of a basketball game to hold the ceiling up. So the community rallied. There was support from the Southport Colored Citizens League, which is an interesting, fascinating story all by itself. But they wrote letter after letter after letter to the superintendent of schools and many other people in government, the governor. They pleaded their case for betterment of the school and tried to point out that they really needed some assistance from government. So they did a lot of work to try to make that situation better. And in addition to that, the families and the students, like the people in the Brick Masonry Club, they worked together to do some great improvements to the school. That Gymatorium that was so dilapidated, they didn't just complain that, wow, our Gymatorium really is awful. They did something about it. They rallied together and they built a new Gymatorium. The brick program, students, teachers, families, they rallied together and they built a new Gymatorium for the students to use. So it's community activity like that that was amazing. And earlier on in the 40s, Professor Calvinist and some other folks in the community rallied. There was an abandoned high school over in Franklin Square, and I guess it was going to be torn down or something like that. They requested these 2 wings that were on that building, if they could have them for their school. So yes, they got them, and they were actually rolled through town over to BCT, and that more than doubled the space available in the school. So it's activities like that where people don't just lay down and go, man, this really sucks. They do something about it, and they bring that passion and they pull together. So we can't talk about this story without talking about segregation, desegregation, and integration, which are 3 different things. Desegregation is achieved through court order or voluntary means. Integration refers to a social process in which members of different racial and ethnic groups experience fair and equal treatment within a desegregated environment. Integration requires segregation. You can put people in a room and say, oh, desegregation, but is it really integration until there's a cohesiveness amongst that group of people? So, the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Most people are aware of that. In 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States held that a state may not deny any person on account of race the right to attend school, any school that it maintains. I'm not going to go in a deep dive here. North Carolina drug its feet as long as they possibly could on this count. And one of the things that the government here did, this is a replica of a 1957 Brunswick County, we call it the choice letter. by George F. Williams, who was superintendent of the Brunswick County Schools. And basically it says, okay, everything's separate but equal now. So, and this letter went out to every child, just regardless of race, every family. Before the new school season starts, you'll just decide where you want to go. You can go to whatever school you want, whether it's previously black or white. Well, that really wasn't super helpful as far as trying to pull together and really to promote integration. Because what do you think happened for the most part? Do you think it really supported integration? Not too much. Bless his heart, though. So, we come to the end of a chapter in history. On January 19th of 1969, Southport High School was destroyed by fire. Desegregation, not integration, but desegregation was accelerated as the white students from Southport High then attended BCHS. And this created challenges. There was more overcrowding, and they already were overcrowded. And at this point in time in history, it was a time of heightened racial tensions. So you're pulling all of these kids into a building and a structure, and it's just tough. So complications continued as graduation for the class of 1970 was canceled. And in 1971, the doors of the new South Brunswick High School opened, and students moved to that campus. So a lot of the students went there or to other locations in the vicinity. And the old BCHS school building over on Lord Street, as you may know now, has been converted for use as a satellite facility for the Brunswick County Community College. So you can still go by and see a version of the school. And the cool thing is it's not gone. Because sadly, in the South, so many of the original Rosenwald schools, they're gone. They're history, as they say. And it's sad. They are now national treasures. So that's great. They are protected now. But we lost so many of them. So it's kind of cool that we here in Southport still have a version, if not the original version of the school. We still have that building, and it still serves the community, which is really cool. So, well, yes.
Just okay, in 1954, there was a court order for desegregation, and in 1969 in Southport, the schools were still totally segregated.
Yeah.
Okay, we're talking more in, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
More than 10 years.
Yeah, So, this is a super big story to try to put in a relatively small space, physical space in the museum. I'm grateful for that space, but it's a huge story. There's so much to tell. There's so many aspects of it that I would love to expand on, but I've got about this much space. So we're incorporating a digital frame, and that is going to be a slideshow of BCT alumni. And the nice thing about that is I know for a fact I don't have my arms around everybody that I would like to, but as people step forward and say, hey, I've got a picture, I was an alumni, I can add it because it's digital. So that can continue to grow. We are also doing, in tandem with this, an element which is pretty cool. How many of you have done any of our walking tours or know about pocket sites tours? Okay, all right. Well, Pocket Sites is a really neat tool that you can use on a mobile device. And Bob Sturge in the back, he has already created multiple walking tours and driving tours with different focus around the area, which is really neat. It's a free app. It's really neat to use. There's even this fabulous English voice that tells you a little blurb about the site that you're seeing. We also still have the good old paper copy of the walking tours, and we will also have that for this tour. But the Pocket Sites tour that's being created, actually Ms. Liz Fuller over here is doing all of the research and work on pulling that together. And it's going to incorporate elements, not just from an educational standpoint and that focus of the exhibit, but it will serve the entire exhibit for African American locations of interest and historical spots in the community, whether it was business or a church or what have you. So that will kind of live throughout. So that's just another wonderful element we'll have.
Are there any apps available for the regular tours? Is there an app?
For the pocket sites.
Oh, it's pocket sites?
It's called pocket. Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
great, thank you.
Yeah, one of the things to add about pocket sites is it not only contains, will take you to the tours of Southport, but if you visit Charleston, it will show you the tours that are available in Charleston, Philadelphia, Wilmington. So it is a nice resource that you use across the country. I actually think it's also somewhat international too.
Okay, I'm gonna download it right now.
Yeah. And so, as we get ready to wrap up here today, I want to leave you with a question to ask yourself and to think about. What can we learn from the educators and families that inspired young people to believe that they could make a difference in the face of hardship and adversity, even when other voices said that they couldn't? So if you apply everything we've talked about, that passion, that spark, that desire for education and to educate, and the great lengths that families, students, and educators went through to make sure that this happened for their children, how do we apply that to today? And the perception that students have around education and their role in their own education, or families' roles in education, or communities' roles in our children's educations. How do we apply this level of passion and dedication that made stuff happen out of nothing? How do we apply that to Brunswick County and the surrounding areas today for our students? So anyway, thank you for coming. I appreciate y'all spending your morning with us. We do Tuesday Talks every month, hopefully everyone knows. And Donnie Joyner, who's not able to join us here today, he has a wonderful program for Black History coming up in February at the Community Center. And there will be some really interesting folks speaking. And
Well, it'll
the
be
exhibit
it'll
opens.
be the 5th or 6th Black History Weekend. It's not just one thing, and yeah, he is a one-man show.
Yeah.
And what I enjoyed last year, they had young children dancing, they had gospel choirs, and it's just a good time that people will learn things they've never known.
Exactly, and that's February 8th through the 10th, Friday night through Sunday morning, or I'm not sure how long it goes, but definitely something to look into. There's a flyer up in the visitor center area with the details on it, and I'm sure that Donnie's probably got it on his Facebook page or whatnot, but he's really put together an amazing program if you're interested in that. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I want to follow up though by introducing again Liz Fuller, who's a volunteer for the Historical Society, and also about to take that fatal step of becoming a member of the board. However, more important to our discussion here is she is the speaker for February's second Tuesday talk, and Liz will be talking about, why don't you describe what you're going to be talking about, please?
I'm going to be talking about Harry Hayden, who was a journalist who had some ties to Southport, and about a book he wrote about the Wilmington Rebellion of 1898. So, and his version of it and some other versions of it, and hopefully we'll get to the truth of what happened.
And then just to continue on March, Donnie Joyner is going to be the speaker, and about his...
He really had decided, because it's gonna be what he wasn't having this main thing for the Black History Weekend.
Okay.
I mean,
All right.
well, we have lots to do.
You have lots to do, and both Liz's talk and Donnie Joyner, you're going to enjoy both of them, and I think we're all going to learn a lot.
Well, your question here, thank goodness for Bob, because ever since we started these Tuesday Talks about 4 years ago, he was feeling like the Black community had not been even exposed to the black children, they didn't know their history. So we've had 3 or 4 talks forever on what you could call black history. And what we need to do is get more people who are black coming. I can count the people that have come. I mean, even when we're doing one on the midwives, you know, there were a lot of great-grandchildren, but they didn't come. You know, so we're still trying, Bob and I are still at it, and if we can educate one person, that's good. We start there.
Talking about what Lisa was talking about, the conditions in school. Like some of you, I went to public schools in the 1950s and early 1960s. That feeling that you talk about of a community focusing on the schools and it being the center of your universe, and teachers and educators who you did feel like you were their children.
You saw them at church, you saw them everywhere.
Right. The difference was, we didn't have any adversity. We did not have any adversity. We had we had all the new books, we had, wonderful facilities and so on. But there was that feeling, and I'm afraid today that's also just a completely lost across schools, is that feeling of home, of focus, whether you're black or white.
But also, I mean, I came from Halifax County, that's always been about 70% black. When I graduated from high school, there were 27 white children in a 10 circumference area. The black high school had 270 graduates. But the thing is, my class didn't, the South has been poor. The blacks had the least, but nobody went to school 4 years of high school till after World War II. But in this town, Trudy Huffman O'Neill Young talks about her brother always playing basketball over at the training school. So people knew each other as people. They played together, they swam in the river together. They were segregated. And it sounds like a long time to get segregation, but at that time in my county, there were 56 black schools and 11 white. And my mama happened to be chairman of the county school boards when the Brown decision came out. Every black principal came to the house because they were afraid they would lose their jobs. But integration is not easy to do. Nobody wants to give up. And the black school also burned. Those 2 buildings you're talking about, the thing is still there. That's the art gallery. And that was a school with 2 wings initially, and then it became the courthouse and anything that was needed for. But they rolled it over.
Yeah.
And training, I didn't find out until last year when I was giving a talk on education. Training school was training for the teachers. It was like them going to practice teaching to go out and train others, so the Jeans teachers came in. But training did not mean like a training school usually is where juvenile delinquents went. So it wasn't an ugly name trying to slam the black children. It was a training school for teachers, and that's how they could keep up with it.
Thanks.
But another thing here, I think the blacks in this town, from my age down, I've never known any small town to have as many college graduates. And I mean 4-year colleges away from here.
There's so
And
many
I
success
think
stories.
what
It's
it
amazing.
came about, you had men here who worked in the piney woods, you had men who were fishermen, watermen. They had to make independent decisions every day, so they were more aware and capable of freedom. A lot of people have freedom and say, well, where do I go? Where am I gonna work? If they'd been controlled in a field all of their lives and their families, it was far different from making independent decisions, because you had entrepreneurs, you had businessmen, black, all over this town. It's just a level I've never seen in North Carolina. And I really think it's due to the confidence. And Professor Calvin is coming from Missouri somewhere. He didn't know how bad the South was, so he just taught him like he had been taught.
Yeah.
Which is, his expectations were high. Never heard him say, we're gonna go to the Lord's coming to nominate him. Never.
Right. No, absolutely.
A comment?
Yeah, I was, the community, now, the building is now the community college extension on Lord Street, and it's also a voting site.
Oh, okay.
And so I was over there voting, standing in line, and there was an African-American woman in front of me. She was probably 75, maybe 80, and we started chatting. I never got her name, but she looked around, she goes, "I have so many happy memories of this building."
That is so cool.
Yeah, because they kept 2 rooms of it. People said it was what used to be the home ec room. Now, that was established. The white school didn't have the lavatories and the stoves and
Does the
everything.
community college acknowledge that, celebrate that?
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
wonderful mural, a timeline on the wall.
Yes,
It talks about it. They did a
But
great job.
everybody I know said there are 2 rooms left of that second Rosenwald school.
Yeah.
But one thing Rosenwald also said, it had to be for black children. He wanted the sweat equity and the money from both, but it's for black children.
Yeah.
And until that, mainly the AMEZ church, that's where children went to school. Because their pastors were both educated as well as called
Yeah.
religion. So
Right.
schools did a lot of it.
Liz?
I just had 2 comments I wanted to make. One, to Musette's point about the number of people who graduated from BCT and then went on to, illustrious careers, college education. You're going to have all of those, or not all of them, but you're going to have
As
some.
many as will give.
Yeah,
yes.
in the exhibit.
In the digital frame,
And,
yes.
and we're also hoping that we'll get more people, as people realize that we're looking for pictures and success stories and,
Right.
and accomplishments, that you can add more to that, so people
Right.
can find out more by going to the exhibit when it opens.
Right.
And then my second comment was, just to put it in perspective, I know you mentioned, the Topeka versus the Brown, yeah, Brown
Versus,
V board.
right, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, was in the 50s, and integration didn't really start here until 1970. But I grew up in Ohio, and I went to school in the 70s, and I remember when busing started. I was in high school when we had forced busing, because we hadn't managed to integrate, we hadn't
Yeah.
followed it. So even though it sounds like it's a long time, and certainly it was longer than it should have been, it wasn't just in the South, it wasn't just in North Carolina, it was in other,
Oh,
states
Boston
throughout.
was-
Boston was the
Right, I was
most,
gonna
most,
say, we
most
didn't turn
resident.
over buses, but you don't throw rocks at a person you know. And in small towns, you knew the mama or the daddy or your children played together. But it wasn't easy, but we certainly didn't do a lot of things in the Northeast did.
Yeah,
although-
so I'm just saying, I didn't want it to be, let's pile on North Carolina, because it was in a lot of places.
Well, I
But,
thank you very much.
but it certainly, but it took longer everywhere than it should
Put an
have.
exclamation point on that. In northeastern Pennsylvania, the coal regions, we were still trying to figure out if a Polish Catholic girl could marry a German Catholic guy.
Yeah,
Right.
Grandma
that
was
was-
saying, you can't do that, that's a mixed marriage.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I
Exactly.
think the whole
Slow.
country has had prejudice, whether you're
Sure.
French Canadian or in the Great Lakes. We didn't have school buses, nobody did, the roads weren't paved. I mean, nobody had indoor plumbing, it's not that they had to go to an outhouse, most people did. I mean, the South was 50 years behind the rest of the world. That's why I say to my friends who come down here, just act like you joined the Peace Corps. But you did have to take shots to learn how to dig or tree. But I mean, we admit we were behind, but maybe we could get it right since we have so much to learn from.
Well, thank you again for coming.
Oh, thank you.